The United Nations rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures has highlighted the negative effects of the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, where she conducted an official 10-day visit. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's lawyers rested their case in the Senate's impeachment trial on Friday after making less than 3 hours of arguments. And Germany's health minister will consider introducing penalties for people who cut the line for coronavirus vaccines. Hello and welcome to teleSUR English. I am Estefania Bravo from the headquarters of Quito in Ecuador. This is from the south. In Venezuela, the United Nations Human Rights Rapporteur Elena Duhan presented a report on the situation in Venezuela in the face of the unilateral coercive sanctions imposed by the U.S. government against the country. In a press conference, the UN official shared a preliminary report in which she offered an account of the negative effects of the sanctions imposed by Washington. Elena Duhan explained that after holding meetings with different sectors of the country, she determined that the U.S. blockade considerably affects the development of the Venezuelan people. She noted with concern how the unilateral measures applied against Venezuela, its institutions and assets abroad violate international law.
By secondary sanctions or the fear of them, donors and international humanitarian NGOs, beneficiaries of assistance from the international organizations traditionally financed by Venezuela, while low-income people, women, children, and people with special needs or chronic or severe diseases are affected most with regards to the whole scope of human rights, including civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights, as well as the right to development. I welcome reports of the Venezuela's government greater engagement.
President Nicolás Maduro offered a statement on the report issued by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the unilateral coercive measures following her visit to Venezuela, pointing out that U.S. sanctions have led to a humanitarian crisis.
Today, the rapporteur has made a call to the government of the United States, to the government of the European Union, to review the sanctions and lift the sanctions against Venezuela, because they have exacerbated a gigantic, enormous humanitarian crisis against the population. We have resisted, in the first place, thanks to our conscience, aware of why they are attacking Venezuela, aware of the criminal, illegal, unjust, and immoral nature of those sanctions, and we have confronted them one by one.
In Argentina, the governor of Tierra del Fuego, Gustavo Melella, denounced the incursion of the United States nuclear-armed submarine and British military aircraft in the South Atlantic Peace and Cooperation Zone recognized by the United Nations. The governor identified the vessel of the USS Greenville submarine. Melella stressed that the incident represents a serious violation of UN resolutions concerning Argentina's sovereignty over the Malvinas Islands. The incursion comes at a time when the United States Navy, together with the British Air Force, are carrying out military exercises with a nuclear-powered fleet in a strip of the South Atlantic declared a zone of peace and cooperation by the United Nations. The maneuvers were also acknowledged by the U.S. Navy. Moving on to Ecuador, the contenders for the presidential runoff against Andrés Arauz, Guillermo Lasso, and Yacu Pérez agreed to ask the National Electoral Council to repeat the vote count. In the midst of a tight race for second place in the first round of voting, in which Lasso beat Pérez by 19.74% to 19.38%, both candidates agreed to request a recount of the vote in accordance with the Ecuadorian legal framework. The request must be submitted to the National Electoral Council for its consideration, which includes the availability of funds for its execution. Candidate Guillermo Lasso stated that the initiative would be above partisan interest. Meanwhile, the Cotopaxi indigenous and rural movement warned of its rejection of an eventual pact between the right-wing candidates who have already made allegations of electoral fraud.
Based on the factual documentation of the evidence that we have from a single ballot through to the original vote counts to the compared system, they tell us exactly the opposite. We have serious and substantiated doubts, and we could cite even evidence regarding this process that you, Madam President, said is democratic.
That is why I have said clearly, and I repeat now, I support the proposal of the candidate, Yacu Perez, to the effect that within the framework of the law, the counting of the votes will be conducted within the framework of the law.
More than 3 million votes consolidated the victory of Ecuador's presidential candidate for the Union for Hope coalition, Andrés Arauz, in the general elections held on February 7th. According to data from the National Electoral Council, Arauz obtained 3.77 million votes in last Sunday's elections, which represents 32.20%. Arauz passed the second round scheduled for April 11th with an advantage of more than 12 points over his closest rivals for the presidency, Guillermo Lasso and Yacu Perez, who are disputing second place for the runoff. In this sense, Perez, who came just behind Lasso, has denounced alleged electoral fraud to remove him from the race for the presidency. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador welcomed U.S. President Joe Biden's decision to stop the building of the wall on the country's shared border after ending the national emergency in the border area. The Mexican head of state described Biden's decision as historic. Obrador also said that every U.S. president in the last 28 years built part of the wall, regardless of whether they were Republican or Democrat. The border wall currently stretches 1,488 kilometers away. Mexico and the U.S. share a border of more than 3,000 kilometers. The construction of the wall was one of former President Donald Trump's promise in his attacks on migrants, whom he described as criminals, to prevent them from entering the country.
This is a decision that we welcome because the wall has been under construction for some time now. To put it very objectively, both Democrat and Republican presidents have built parts of the wall. Almost all of them have built a part of it. And now President Biden has decided that he will no longer continue to build the wall on the border. It is a historic development.
In Colombia, the hearing of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights against a state regarding the genocide of members of the Patriotic Union Party over 30 years ago has concluded. On the last day of the hearing, the court heard from victims who alleged that more than 6,000 assassinations and a host of other crimes were committed against members of the party by state agents. For its part, the defense affirmed that peace organizations continue investigating the event in order to compensate those affected. In court, experts from both sides offered their account to establish responsibility for the genocide. We're taking a very short break now. Join us again after this, and also don't forget to follow me on my Twitter account at Ibravo Telesur for more news. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's defense team have rested their case in the Senate this Friday after making less than 3 hours of argument in his impeachment trial. House Democrats took up 2 days to make their case, including presentations of harrowing footage of last month's Capitol riots. The trial then moved into the question and the answer phase, with members of the Senate submitting questions for both sides. Trump's lawyers are arguing that an impeachment trial of a former president is unconstitutional, a point that legal experts dispute. They also claim Trump's speech at a rally that preceded the violence at the Capitol, in which he incited the crowd, which repeated false claims of election fraud, is protected by the First Amendment.
So we have a complete lack of evidence for the article of impeachment presented by the House managers. So why are we here? Politics. Their goal is to eliminate a political opponent, to substitute their judgment for the will of the voters.
Haitian political parties officially received copies of a draft constitutional reform bill for their evaluation. Haiti's Minister of Electoral Affairs, Mathias Pierre, confirmed the delivery of copies of the draft constitutional bill to 94 political organizations. The bill addresses the establishment of a presidential system, which includes the replacement of the prime minister by an elected vice president and the dismantling of the Senate to be replaced with a single-chamber National Assembly. 10% of members of which will come from the diaspora. The bill allows access to governmental and legislative positions for Haitian residents abroad and for authorities holding multiple nationalities, a right vetoed in the current constitution. The proposals will be discussed by different sectors of society until February 22nd, after which the bill could undergo changes and amendments according to the proposals collected, while the final vote of the bill is scheduled for April 25th. And Haitians have once again taken to the streets to call for President Jovenel Moïse to step down, who they say is illegally extending his term in office. Moïse tried on Tuesday to force out 3 judges who were proposed as potential interim national leaders to replace him as the country's political crisis intensifies, including interim opposition leader Joseph Messene Jean-Louis. Moving on, hundreds of women's rights activists and their supporters rallied in Nepal's capital on Friday to call for an end to violence and discrimination against women. Protesters also demand the scrapping of a proposed law that would restrict travel for many women. While marching in the heart of Kathmandu, they chanted slogans demanding equality. Activists say even though the country's constitution guarantees equal rights to women, there is much more that needs to be done to make that a reality. They describe their proposed law that would require women under the age of 40 to get permission from their family and local government to travel to the Middle East or Africa as a violation of human rights. Protesters tried to march to the Prime Minister's office but were blocked by riot police and barbed wire barricades.
Discriminate against an underage girl and getting raped and killed, but the police and the state are not concerned at all.
We are from different backgrounds, but have all gathered here to make sure that all women in our generation and the next generation is safe.
Spain's former health minister Salvador Illa is hoping to unseat Catalonia's ruling separatists in Sunday's regional election. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez hopes a win by Illa, who is heading the ticket for his ruling Socialist Party, will de-escalate tensions after a turbulent few years in which the Catalan parliament briefly declared independence following a banned 2017 referendum, sparking Spain's worst political crisis in decades. During Catalonia's last election in December 2017, the Socialists came fourth, but they have risen in the polls since Illa's unexpected nomination in December. The Socialist Party of Catalonia is now running neck and neck with the 2 separatist formations that had governed the northeastern region since 2015. However, the election could see a record low turnout due to the pandemic, which has caused thousands to refuse the call to staff voting stations. Moving on to Russia now, where record-breaking snowfalls descended on the central part of the country. Snow-clearing vehicles and city cleaners were working around the clock and struggling to keep streets and sidewalks free of snow. Dozens of accidents crippled traffic in Moscow. City authorities requested drivers to use public transportation if possible. Special snow-clearing trains were also shoveling snow away from the tracks as railroad workers used compressed air to clear stations. The forecast offered no respite, with the snow projected to keep on falling throughout the week. And moving on, the Secretary of State of the United States, Anthony Blinken, recently said that he does not support the recognition of the sovereignty of Israel over the occupied Syrian Golan, even though noting that the territory is relevant to Israel's security. The Syrian government considered that these statements do not implement any change in the Washington policy of unconditional support of the Israeli occupation of this Syrian territory. Our correspondent has a story.
Washington has no legal foundation to speak about the sovereignty of the Israeli entity over the Syrian Golan Heights, like Tel Aviv does not have the right to claim this Syrian territory. This is the opinion of many Syrians who endured that this is a Syrian Arab territory, and it will always be like that, and that they would not stop fighting until its total liberation.
Netanyahu does not have the right to say that Golan is going to remain under the sovereignty of the Israel entity, because East Palestine is a territory that belongs to the Palestinians and the Arabs, as well as Golan is a Syrian Arab territory, and without question it will remain like that. Syrian people and leadership are determined to continue the struggle to release occupied Golan and recover all occupied territories.
In spite of this new position of the United States administration, which contradicts the position of a former President Donald Trump regarding the occupied Syrian goal, and on the ground the situation remains the same. The Israeli occupation regime, with the support of Washington, continues with its colonialist plans in that Syrian territory, in addition to stealing its natural resources and expropriating its growing land. It uses this territory as a platform from which launch continuous aggressions against the Syrian people and army.
The presence of this occupying entity in the Syrian territories is not legal and violates all international and humanitarian laws. And this violation continues with the support of the United States. So, the change of position on this matter, it is no more than an act of media propaganda that contradicts the actual U.S. action in favor of the Israeli occupation, which is the essence of the problem.
In the War of Liberation of October, 48 years ago, the Syrian Arab army recovered a third of the Syrian Golan occupied by the Zionist entity. However, and despite the numerous resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly and its Security Council, which demanded to put an end to the Israeli occupant since 1967, the Zionist entity has under occupation an area of 1,200 square kilometers, rich in natural resources, located in the south of Syria, a situation that the Syrians are committed to change, in disregard of Washington's support to the Israeli occupation of this Syrian territory.
We're taking one last short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. Germany's health minister said on Friday that he will consider introducing penalties for people who cut the line for coronavirus vaccines.
The trend in the incidence of COVID infections continues. Fortunately, the number of cases is declining. The 7-day incidence is currently 62, and the progress varies greatly from region to region. In many intensive care units, the situation is stabilizing, but it is still tense, and unfortunately, many people still die in connection with COVID-19. On the other hand, on the topic of sanctions, meaning penalties, the infection protection law of course also includes sanctions. Starting at fines, there too, we will now examine in Parliament as part of the legislative process. We started that debate today, whether sanctions in this area could make sense.
Speaking on Friday during a virtual meeting of the co-founders of the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, a global collaboration mechanism to fight the pandemic, French President Emmanuel Macron said the pandemic is at a critical stage due to the new variants of the coronavirus.
We are in a great critical situation, and obviously a lot of high-income countries are dealing with the pandemic today and trying to obviously vaccinate, organize their country in order to fight against the virus and the different mutants. But we have this issue too, precisely fix the pandemic as well as the low-income countries. And what we launched with ACTA initiative was very important a few months ago, which is to have this fair global access for vaccines, but not just vaccines, treatments, diagnosis, and as well to have improved the organization of the different health systems. And I think the different pillars of the ACTAs are extremely important, and we can see the pressure in terms of health system. We can see sometimes the political and diplomatic pressure we can have. But for me, we need some clarification and new commitments to be sure that we deliver clearly on the ground what we promised.
This Friday, the Czech government imposed a complete lockdown on 3 of the hardest hit counties to help contain the spread of a highly contagious variant of the coronavirus. 2 counties in the western Czech Republic on the German border and another county in the northern part of the country located on the border with Poland are affected. The residents of the counties are barred from leaving and people without residency cannot travel there. Police have been deployed to ensure the measures. The counties have been facing the highest occurrence of the fast-spreading coronavirus variant initially identified in Britain. The capacity of the local hospitals have reached their limits and COVID-19 patients have to be transported to hospitals in other parts of the Czech Republic.
The problem is that the numbers have been increasing ever since the spring and reached their peak in January, and that long-lasting pandemic situation is the main reason why our hospital, which is already overrun, is reaching its maximum capacity to be able to treat patients. The people weren't able to rest for several months, and it is also hard on personnel relationships and family ties. And we can see that the impact on people's psyche is huge, and we will probably be seeing this for some time after this is over.
Hungary on Friday began vaccinating its population with the Russian-made Sputnik 5 coronavirus vaccine. According to Chief Medical Officer Cecilia Müller, the vaccination began in 4 hospitals in the country's capital, Budapest. Müller added that around 2,800 doses of the Russian vaccine were expected to be administered on Friday. Hungary also expects to receive 500,000 doses of the Chinese Sinopharm COVID-19 vaccine next week, along with 200,000 more doses of Sputnik 5 later this month. The country has purchased enough Sputnik 5 doses to treat 1 million people and enough Sinopharm doses to treat 2.5 million. The Director General of the World Health Organization has noted that all hypotheses remain open to the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic after a WHO expert mission failed to find evidence that the virus originated in China.
Some questions have been raised as to whether some hypotheses have been discarded. Having spoken with some members of the team, I wish to confirm that all hypotheses remain open and require further analysis and studies.
And lastly, President of Bolivia, Luis Arce, this Friday enacted the health emergency law that will have as its priority addressing the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The law establishes the creation of a national strategic council for emergencies in the sector, as well as keeping records of health services, contracting customs clearance, and also a sanctions regime. The president of the Chamber of Senators, Andronico Rodriguez, affirmed that the law will be put into effect immediately in favor of all Bolivians. The measure generated criticism from part of the medical union that rejects the proposal, to which the head of Senate ratified the adherence to what is stipulated in the Constitution and clarified that health services cannot be interrupted in any way. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And don't forget to follow us on our social media accounts. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram as well. For TeleSUR English, I am Estefania Bravo. See you next time.